great music and great wine. Is there a better pairing? Elgar's last notable work, the Cello Concerto, was something of a departure from his earlier music. In it, the passionate lyricism he was so well known for is condensed, lending the piece a sense of maturity and complexity. It is by turns intense and wistful, energetic and contemplative. Likewise, this Chardonnay is quite a departure from the Tarrawara Estate Reserve Chardonnay. This vineyard, with a south-facing slope, develops lively fruit and is then matured for 8 months in French oak, resulting in a wine of great balance and purity with developed and layered flavours. Breathe in the perfumed aroma of citrus fruits while you immerse your senses in the experience of this astounding piece of music. Elgar's Cello Concerto, brought to you by Tarrawara Estate and the MSO. It's the perfect pairing. Receive 10% off the Tarrawara Ears Wide Open wine pack now at www.tarrawara.com.au/wine/MSO.
The Melbourne Symphony Orchestra respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners of this land, the people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. On this unceded land, we celebrate the oldest continuous music practice in the world. In our language of music, we honour this country and offer our support to elders past, present and emerging, and embrace our shared future.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Councillor Jamal Hakim, and it's my pleasure to join you tonight on behalf of the City of Melbourne. I'd like to first start by also respectfully acknowledging that we are meeting on unceded lands. We are here on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nations. I'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past and present. If I can also acknowledge my fellow councillor Philip Lulu, who's here tonight, Cybec Assistant Conductor Carlo Antonioli, musicians of the MSO, cello soloists Nadia Barrow, Isaac Davis, and Joshua Jones. Welcome, everyone. You are in for a treat. We are all in for a treat, particularly when the MSO performs, but tonight's concerto must be one of the most loved for many of us. Composed in 1919, Elgar's Cello Concerto is memorable for many reasons. It is a haunting work, composed in the shadow of the First World War. And Jacqueline du Pré's recording brought new audiences to this concerto, so it's so special to be here. Tonight's audience will have the chance to learn so much more than through the Eyes Wide Open series, Ears Wide Open series, in the capable hands of the MSO. Eyes and ears, the two senses. And this event is the first of 3 Ears Wide Open events for 2023, supported by our Arts and Creative Investment Partnership program. The City of Melbourne is always pleased to support Ears Wide Open because we recognise the immense pleasure that MSO brings to the people of our city and state. It is truly a remarkable Melbourne institution. And we want to acknowledge the contribution that fine musicians make in Melbourne and beyond. We are, after all, the music capital of Australia. We love to be the capital of everything, don't we? And we can't be without these fabulous musicians, so I think let's give them all a round of applause. Tonight, the MSO is joined by musicians from the Australian National Academy of Music, part of the Orchestral Training Partnership, and I'm really excited about this because this reflects the orchestra's commitment to opportunities for Australia's next generation, something that we must continue to build to ensure that we continue to be the music capital. Thanks for joining us and enjoy Elgar's Cello Concerto. We'll be starting very shortly after a bit of fine-tuning. Thank you.
That phrase, music, that you've just heard there is possibly one of the most important phrases of music to me personally in the whole repertoire. I heard it so early in my life that I can't actually remember the first time I heard it, but growing up in the late 70s in a household interested in orchestral music, it's hardly surprising that I should have been exposed to possibly the most famous recording of the work, the legendary Jacqueline du Pré recording made in 1965. Hearing that sound as a child of that instrument and its incredible expressive possibilities is one very important part of what brought me to a life engaged with music and the cello in particular. And I would be very surprised if there weren't a few other people in the room tonight for whom that was the same experience. My name is Nick Bochner. I'm the Head of Learning Engagement at the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. I was also very privileged to be a cellist with this orchestra for over 20 years, hence my great passion for this piece of music. I'm very pleased to welcome you here to this wonderful event in the beautiful Melbourne Recital Centre. I'd also like to welcome those of you joining us live on YouTube. And of course, a big thank you to our ears wide open presenting partner, Tarrawarra Estate. Big thank you to the City of Melbourne, and of course to the Crown Resorts and Packer Family Foundations for their support of these events. Of course, I'm very pleased to be joined on stage by the members of the marvellous Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, my great colleague, Cybec Assistant Conductor Carlo Antonioli. And this is, I think, a first in Ears Wide Open. So I'm not sure that we've done concertos before, and I'm very excited that we were able to bring in one of our wonderful partners in Melbourne, the Australian National Academy of Music, and you will hear from not one, not two, but three incredible young soloists from that institution, starting with the marvellous Josh Jones. And can I just say before we start, it's very brave of them to agree to do this, because to play this concerto is difficult. To play with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra is even harder. But to play it in fragments with me standing up and talking for minutes on end while they're trying to do it is just extraordinary, so I hope you'll enjoy that. Now, as I said, I can't remember not actually knowing this music, so that phrase was so familiar to me that it was only when I started thinking about preparing for tonight that I realised that it's actually quite a radical departure from what concertos had been. And in a way, it encapsulates the fascinating contradictions that are key to understanding Elgar and his music, and really just how incredibly poignant those contradictions are. Elgar lived in England in a period of enormous change and upheaval from the late 19th century into the early 20th. And despite ultimately earning a knighthood and real recognition as a great composer, he actually spent much of his life as a triple outsider who very much wanted to belong. Firstly, his father was a piano tuner and his mother was the daughter of a farm worker. Now, in Britain at that time, that very much defined his social standing, and it's very hard to move around. Some of you may be familiar with the TV series Downton Abbey. I'm probably a little bit late to that party. I only just finished streaming all of the seasons quite recently, even though it's been around for a while. And it might sound a little bit silly to say, but I was watching that and I was thinking what incredible context it actually gives you for this piece of music. It's happening at exactly the time that Elgar was composing and runs right through the time this piece was written. Just for context, if you do know that piece, Elgar is exactly the same age as the butler, Mr. Carson. No, this meant, of course, with that relatively low birth, he even though his farm-born mother ensured that he had a very good education, and his father tuned pianos for and quite often mixed with minor aristocracy, Elgar himself married well above his position. He would never be considered truly part of the establishment. Think Mr. Branson, Tom Branson. I'll stop talking about Downton Abbey in a minute, I promise. Now, secondly, although I'm going to mention it one more time here, Elgar was brought up a Catholic, and that was really not the thing in refined English circles. And he really longed to move in those circles. And finally, he was actually basically self-taught as a musician. His father was a piano tuner, he had lessons, but as a composer, he just taught himself. There was a lot of music going on where he lived. He played the violin in lots of amateur orchestras. I think one of them belonged to what was charmingly known as the Lunatic Asylum. They had a staff orchestra and he conducted and composed music for them. So what does all this context that I've just given you have to do with the opening of this concerto? Well, I think one of the great contradictions of Elgar is that he was so keen to conform, but his greatest successes were actually when he didn't conform. He studied German music in his self-directed study, and he was a great fan of Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner, and he wanted to compose like that. And they were sort of this great symphonic Germanic approach to composition. But his great breakthrough work, the Enigma Variations, was, as you can imagine, a set of variations. This was quite unusual. And again, with this cello concerto, where the way he starts it, he has departed straight away from all of the norms of the genre. So since the time of Mozart, concerto would normally be structured like a symphony. The soloist would share the work of exposing themes with the orchestra. The orchestra would normally play both themes, hand them over to the soloist. There had been some examples of the soloist starting first, like if you know Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, there's a great flourish to start, but then it proceeds as normal. Here, though, Elgar breaks the mould completely, launching with that phrase that we've just heard, which has much more in common with a cadenza. But again, a cadenza is this passage that you would normally get right at the end of the first movement or the end of the concerto. He starts right there. Again, a concerto is normally associated with brilliance and virtuosity, and that was one of the main reasons for it up to this point. But Elgar starts with this tragic statement, which kind of fades away into this ambiguous, lilting theme. This theme brings us to our next contradiction. Let's examine it just a little bit. Josh, can you just play us that theme that we're about to talk about? It's a very unusual theme. The first thing you notice about it, it has exactly the same rhythm all the way through. It's 6 bars with this lilting rhythm all the way through. That is quite unusual, and I did quite a lot of reading about this. I can't find anyone who would explain to me where that theme came from. Quite often you can imagine what the origin of a theme is. Elgar, unlike other composers of his time in other countries, wasn't interested in folk music. He actually really disliked that approach to composition where you take the folk music of your country and employ it in orchestral music. It was something that was going on a lot. He didn't like it. But it's very hard to hear that theme and not think of something English. So it's not a folk song. But how did he come across it? Well, the story goes that he woke from a relatively dangerous operation. It was tonsil removal, which doesn't sound like much these days, but in 1918, or wherever it was quite dangerous. He woke from that operation, asked for some paper, and wrote down this theme. It had somehow been sort of percolating in his subconscious. And I don't think he intentionally drew on this English folk heritage, but somehow that has come through. There are some who suggest that this theme traces the shape of the countryside around Melbourne, which was a part of the country very dear to him. So you have these 6 bars, there's a 2-bar shape, a 2-bar shape, and a 2-bar shape, which you can imagine sort of might look a little bit like a landscape painting. Maybe it's just a distillation of a long-forgotten folk melody. One feature that I do notice about this melody is it has these very particular proportions. Over the course of the phrase, as I said, you have these 3 repeating shapes, and within each of those, they rise for 2 beats and fall for 4. And this is something that comes back in later movements. And those proportions are actually like very deep and restful breathing. So what I want you to do now, we're going to listen to the orchestra play this tune, and I want you to breathe in as it rises and out as it goes down. I'm going to show you rising and falling, because I do not want to talk across this beautiful sound. But here we go. Take a breath out so you can breathe in as it starts. Wants to fall asleep after that, but you feel this sense of deep rest, and I think that's something quite important in this piece. Now, I've already mentioned his variations on an original theme that are commonly called the Enigma Variations, and I think there's an important key there. It was very successful for him as a breakthrough work, and I think it really informs the success of this piece, and that is his ability to take a relatively simple tune, and the tune of the Enigma Variations is also quite sort of neutral and ambiguous, and put it through all these variations that create characters and a sense of story. So, Josh, can you play us the beginning of the very beginning of the concerto again, please? So that's a great sort of sound, all those chords, but can you just play us what the tune is on the top of that, please? It's got two main features. The first is a rising fourth that sounds like this. And the next bit is this descending thing that describes thirds but kind of turns around them. Just show us the two thirds, B, D, B, and then C, A. So we have this rising fourth and descending thirds. Remember that because it keeps coming back. Let's hear the start of the lilting 9/8 melody, just briefly. So we hear this fourth. So there we have the fourth, and then it descends by turning thirds. And one other really small but important feature of this is that first F sharp, G, F sharp, this semitone. Yeah, that sound. Listen out for that as we go through. And throughout the concerto, we're going to hear variations of this central idea, rising fourth, descending thirds. And it's one of the keys to the success of the work. It's not a tone poem, it is not a structured narrative, but the way Elgar plays with these differently characterised versions of the same idea, you get this sense of story and a sense of journey that is all somehow connected. Now, moving on immediately from this subdued and ambiguous statement of this theme, we get a variation that's shifted in the key and it becomes much less ambiguous with a very different character. It's expressed in this full tutti version. From the very opening phrase, I'd have to say that heroic scale is something that really engaged my interest as a young musician wanting to play the cello. That was really, really good too. You play amazingly well. So we've had these already we've actually had three variations. We have the opening chords, we have it as a lilting ambiguous theme, then we have it as this big powerful statement. He immediately moves on to another theme, but it's built on a variation of this idea. It sounds like this. That first leap of a fourth, it's doubled. We get a fourth and another fourth. We hear that? 2 fourths. That makes a seventh. In music, 4 plus 4 is 7. Just believe me about that. Remember it, it will be important later. And then it's followed by the now familiar descending, turning thirds. So now our theme has got a sort of sense of pastoral respite, but it turns out that this new theme is highly unstable, and throughout the next section it changes in character quite quickly. So as I said before, the form of this movement is quite unlike a traditional concerto first movement where you would have two different contrasting themes and they would be kind of worked through in the traditional way. In this movement, Elgar starts with his theme and then he moves away from it in a series of variations. But then he gets to a certain point and then he works his way back to the beginning by the same variations, pretty much in reverse. What we're going to do is we're going to listen now from the point that we've just gotten to in this movement to the end of it, just so you can hear how he works back from this point to the opening theme. I'm just going to go and sit down while you do that. In a normal performance of the concerto, that low note continues and we go into the second movement. Another big departure from how the concerto was traditionally handled. Again, we've had this very enigmatic first movement, which just explores a single theme in a kind of an arc shape and brings us to this point. The second movement starts with a repetition of those opening chords from the beginning, but they're not tragic now, they're sort of hushed and played pizzicato, which is plucking the strings instead of with the bow. And it gets swept away by the orchestra very suddenly, and that heralds a very unexpected turn, both in terms of the traditional form of a concerto, but also in terms of the emotional content of the work. So it's another recitative. This is something that's going to keep coming back as well in this work. So this questioning fragment that we've just heard there is related to that first idea, forming as it does a fourth and containing the third. Show us the fourth in that one, Josh, this time. And the third. So play the little fragment for us with those 3 notes. The section here is, as I say, it's the next example of several where he takes the idea of a cadenza and he kind of subverts it. He totally changes its purpose. It sort of seems like a normal concerto, but it's there to become a dramatic or narrative device. And here the soloist sounds very uncertain, searching for something, unsure of where to go next. But when he does find a way forward, it is such a massive contrast from the first movement as to be almost incongruous. Let's hear this whole surprising second movement complete. breathtaking every time. I mean, I feel a little bit out of breath just listening to that. Imagine actually playing it. How brilliant. And it is just such a surprise in the context of this piece, isn't it? We have this movement that sounds, I mean, it is so serious, the first movement, and it takes us into this world, and suddenly that comes out of absolutely nowhere. And it does bring me to another question that I have, Carlo, for you. Watching that whole thing to come together as you were playing it then, and I was privileged to watch the rehearsal earlier. I have to ask, Carlo, conducting concertos, it's a different thing, isn't it, from conducting symphonic repertoire?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a completely different game in my mind. At the end of the day, it's still music, so I would go about studying it in the same way. But when it comes to conducting it, normally with orchestral repertoire, a conductor would come up with some idea of how the piece goes, some interpretation, and that's not to say that when we meet the orchestra that there isn't some form of collaboration and together finding some interpretation together. But at least I have an idea of how it's going to go, whereas with a concerto, we're at the beck and call of what the soloist would like to do. So until we meet them, we don't quite know what we're in for.
That's right, and obviously it just brings in, it makes the whole thing a little bit more open-ended, doesn't it? Because particularly in something like we're watching there, I mean, it's moving very fast, and he might just go a little bit faster, and then you've got to make the orchestra catch up, right? And it can be difficult.
Absolutely. We us as musicians, we use this word catching to mean making sure that we land certain parts of musical phrases together, and especially in not so much in earlier concerti in the classical era, sort of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, that time. But once we move into the Romantic era, composers loved to use so-called rubato, this idea of robbed time where we might speed up here or slow down here to be a bit expressive. And that is the biggest nightmare for the conductor, because we have to be ready, absolutely ready to catch anything. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes performers will do it one way in a performance differently to how they did it earlier. And we just have to be ready there to try and catch everything that we can.
Is it something you enjoy doing? Okay.
No. Without any sense of irony, I absolutely love conducting concerti, because it keeps you on your toes, and it really tests all of the stuff we learn at conducting school. It really, you're forced to use everything in the toolbox, and yeah, it's just fantastic, and it's fantastic to be able to. Obviously, with an orchestra, you are making music with all of the musicians that are in the orchestra, but to have someone in the spotlight where there's that strong individual connection, that's fantastic and great fun.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you, Carlo. I think you're doing a marvellous job. Keep doing just that right there. Thank you. So, as I said earlier, this movement that we've just heard, even though it's so incredibly exciting and fast, it starts again with that recitative and a sort of soliloquy, and it just keeps coming back in this piece. And it manages to suggest something of a story being told in the past tense. The opening of the whole work is so clearly tragic. That tragedy arrives in the first movement, fully formed and palpable. And it makes the following episodes, those kind of pastoral ones in the first movement, and then this mercurial second movement, that has an air of recollection and nostalgia. And there is absolutely no doubt that looking back and a sense of loss, that's really what this piece is about. Elgar composed it towards the end of his life, and even though he would live for another 15 years, much was already in the past for him. For one thing, his wife was 9 years his senior. She was very unwell as he was composing this, and she died shortly after the premiere. Another thing that was very poignant for him was that he had worked so hard and so long to be a success as a composer, and it came quite late. He was 42 when his Enigma of Variations, his breakthrough piece, reached a major success. And that meant that he really only had about 10 years in the spotlight before his style began to go out of fashion. Because as I said, this was a very rapidly changing period of history. The Cello Concerto itself, it wasn't a success at the premiere, and it was quite rarely played after his death. The First World War changed many things, of course, but most importantly, it spelled the end of the way of life that his work embodied and celebrated. Despite having been an outsider for his whole life, he greatly mourned the loss of this England that he knew and loved. It does seem, though, that not everyone mourned the loss of it. Just to give you an idea of how quickly and how far his music went out of fashion, in the 1950s there was a publication called The Record Guide, which was obviously a thing you could read to find out what you should listen to. And they said of Elgar's music, boastful self-confidence, emotional vulgarity, material extravagance, a ruthless Philistinism expressed in tasteless architecture and every kind of expensive yet hideous accessory. Such features of a late phase of imperial England are faithfully reflected in Elgar's larger works and are apt to prove indigestible today. I think we don't feel like that about this music anymore. But still, the article then does go on to recommend to listeners, if they can manage to get past all that, then this cello concerto and a couple of his other works are worth listening to. And this view of his music was already forming during the last years of his life, and he was aware of that. And perhaps it's not entirely surprising. Things were changing very fast. Elgar's music was somewhat backward-looking. If you think that this was written in 1919, 7 years after Stravinsky wrote The Rite of Spring, just to name one piece. And if you're interested in exploring this whole kind of fascinating period where there was a long hangover from the Romantic period and a looking forward in the 20th century, there's a concert in early June that features the Elgar Cello Concerto. It's called A Snapshot in Time, and it puts together a whole group of pieces from this exact time that will demonstrate for you just how incredibly different they all were. And of course, the war changed Elgar as well. As this cello concerto was forming in his subconscious, he was working at his house in Sussex, and he could hear the sounds of artillery fire from across the channel. For him, who had grown up in the country with this great love of animals, in particular, the terrible treatment of horses in battle stood as the ultimate symbol of the horror and futility of war. All of this brings us to the third movement of the concerto, and this is the one place where Elgar does conform in some ways to the norms of symphonic music, because this is the emotional heart of the piece, and that is quite standard for a slow movement. Here we find a very, very deep sentiment, but once again expressed in a very English manner. Again, not because it has an English theme, not because it's using English harmonies, but rather because of the way he phrases. In this movement, we find Elgar expressing these very powerful feelings, but he's always not quite concluding the phrase, and it gives this very English sense of reserve and holding back. Now, to find out exactly what I'm talking about, let's invite our next soloist to the stage, Nadia Barrow. So this sort of phrasing of starting but not actually finishing a thought, it starts right at the very beginning of the movement with these phrases that don't quite find a conclusion. And even though the cello continues the line, underneath it, the strings keep stopping. Let's just hear the strings without the solo. And this kind of swallowing the end of a thought, it develops through the movement. At one point, it becomes this idea. The way Elgar achieves this very clever thing, it demonstrates a simple but brilliant orchestration technique, and Elgar used the orchestra absolutely superbly in all of his music. In this case, he has one group of instruments crescendoing and playing a loud note, and underneath that, another group starts a quiet note, which gives you a very sudden drop in dynamic. Here we have the strings crescendoing, and the clarinets and bassoons are left alone. Brilliant effect. Now, superficially, on the face of it, this movement is very far removed from the world of the first movement. The key, for example, it's as far away as you can go. E minor is where we start. This piece is in B flat major. And even if we don't have perfect pitch, there's a real sense that we are quite a long way away. The mood here is reflective and contemplative rather than the brooding and restless feeling we had in the first movement. But there are still some important connections. One is that the main tune in this movement has exactly the same proportions as that lilting 9/8 melody. If you remember, 2 beats rising, 4 beats falling. Can we just hear that, the cello alone with that theme? Listen how it rises and then falls. And there's another connection. In that first one, we had these quick changes from sort of pastoral and then to much less pastoral. This time it's between chromatic writing and diatonic writing. So chromatic is where if you're playing on the piano, you'd be playing lots of white notes and black notes and creeping around by semitones. And the diatonic is where it's all just like the white notes. It sounds like this. And it's an even further extension of this idea of non-finishing phrases. Rather than finding a kind of logical conclusion of the chromatic sequence and those harmonies, it sort of feels like it just gives up and just moves to this neutral diatonic, and it sort of signifies perhaps some kind of acceptance or maybe a mortal tiredness. Now, while this chromatic language of the movement, it has a lot in common with Wagner, who Elgar very greatly admired. But the way he brings it back to this diatonic openness, it erases any sense of Germanness, and the sensibility is all English. There's another element that distinguishes this movement from the density of Wagnerian slow music, and it's this simple rhythmic feature that we get in my good friends the violas right near the beginning of the movement. Listen to the violas. So you can hear the way they're playing off the beats, and it kind of makes everything just kind of lilt and lift and keep moving. Elgar was very, very fond of self-quotation in his music. He would often bring in themes and ideas from his other works, and unfortunately, relatively little of his music is played, so you'd have to be quite an Elgar fan to actually notice all of those. But there's one bit of self-quotation that I really notice in this piece. Towards the end of this movement, there's one final statement of that rising and falling melody, and it's underpinned by a pizzicato descending bass line. And that sounds to me very like the ghost of one of Elgar's patriotic marches that were very famous earlier in his life. And here, again, this ghost of empire just showing its head. It serves to remind of something lost. Now, we had a quick chat to Carlo about conducting a concerto, but Nadia, thank you. Can we just have a quick chat? I'm very interested to know, were you influenced by this piece, like me? Were you influenced by the Elgar Concerto as a young musician?
Certainly. I don't remember ever not loving this piece. Actually, I don't remember not knowing this piece, and I remember begging my cello teacher at the time, when I've never played a concerto before, to play this, and she was like, "Oh, not sure you're ready for it yet." So we didn't start here, but it has a very special place in my heart as the first concerto I ever got to play with an orchestra.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things I think is interesting when you are trying to interpret a piece that you've known for so long and you love so well, how do you go about that? I mean, how do you kind of go back? What do you do to find your own interpretation in a piece like this?
I think there's something quite amazing about this concerto for Elgar, is how much is on the page, how much information is on the page. And I think it's kind of like reading a book. Every time you return to the score, you find more, and you want to find more, and you're a different person every time you return to a piece, and you can do new and different things. You've had more life inspiration, and so I feel like a piece like this matures with you, especially because it is just so incredibly haunting and hopeful and yearning, and things that I don't think I got when I first played it, because I just wasn't there yet.
You talk about maturing with the piece. I mean, obviously you have matured already, but I look forward to hearing you play it maybe in another 20 years or so, because I can imagine the trajectory that we're on is tremendous. Can you tell me a bit about, so we were talking about how conducting is different with concerto. Is it different, from playing there than here, or playing a sonata, or playing in a string quartet? What do you have to do differently when you're out the front?
Lots and not much. I mean, firstly, the nerves are 10 times more. But in terms of your communication, you're still lending and sharing so much. I mean, there's a lot of trust involved in a concerto. I'm trusting Carlo more than any other musician I'd have to play in a string quartet with, because I know that he's going to catch me when I get inspired and I want to go. And same with the musicians around me. I see their eyes on me and they're moving when I move. And it makes you feel really free in a way that when you're playing in a symphony, you kind of don't want to be. You want to be in your section sound, whereas this is something slightly different.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for sharing those insights with us. I think we better listen to the whole second movement complete now. Great, thank you. The whole second, I call it the second movement because traditionally in a concerto, the second movement would be the slow movement. This is the third movement, but it is still the slow movement of Elgar's Cello Concerto. It's almost a shame to start talking again after that. I'm sorry, it's just so incredibly beautiful. But I will start talking. Let's take stock and think about where this leaves us with this piece. We have our very unorthodox first movement. It starts with the ultimate spoiler. We get that declaration of tragedy. And it then sort of wavers uncertainly between that tragedy and something much more reflective. We get that second movement. It's a scherzo of the sort rarely, if ever, heard in a concerto. You'd normally get that sort of mercurial scherzo in a symphony, and I think that's where Elgar's taken it from. Maybe borrowing a little bit of inspiration from Mendelssohn and his incredible fairies that he evokes with those semiquavers. We then have that slow movement that we've just heard. It's so often the heart of a symphonic work like a romantic concerto, and indeed it is here, but it's full of those phrases that never quite manage to finish. So in these three movements, Elgar has covered a great deal of musical, emotional, and narrative territory. Having said that, he has done it pretty much with one theme that he has varied right through this whole thing. How does he bring it all together in the finale to make it all make sense? We're going to have to invite Isaac Davis to the stage so that we can find out. Welcome, Isaac. Nice one. So there's your answer. Again, it's a recitative and a soliloquy. And once again, you can probably tell it's a variation of that theme that we heard in the first movement and explored closely. It's got that rising figure followed by the descending turn of thirds. Isaac, can we just have, yes, after you adjust the end pin. Marvellous. It's one of the annoying things about playing the cello is the end, chairs are different sizes and the end pin, all that kind of stuff, yeah. Let's just hear that opening theme just to remind us how it's got the rising figure and the descending turning thirds. There you go, you hear that jump and then stepping back by thirds. And then do you remember this little idea from the first movement? Yep, so that idea, in this movement, now it's become this. We've got the same harmony and we've got the same rising scale, but it's a radically different mood. Elgar has so far in the work set up this sense of inevitable loss, this tragic opening followed by what feels like memories and farewells. But suddenly here, at the beginning of this movement, the musical narrative takes a very significant twist towards an entirely new element, a sense of fight and resistance. The opening theme that we heard, that rising one with the thirds, has now been turned into something more like a traditional theme in a symphony, where before it had had those 2 rising beats followed by 4 falling. It now has 2 rising and 2 falling. And then you get an extension of the falling part that becomes a rising sequence. And when you pair that with the entire orchestra playing offbeats, the effect is one of the cello in resolute defiance of opposing forces. And then this fight that we hear, it's expressed in flipping the theme from one mood to the other, and it's really quite extreme. 1 minute, it's cheerful and flippant, like in this variation where we have the theme in the orchestra. And in this case, the cello is accompanying like this. And then that quickly transitions into a completely different version, which is actually quite menacing. And then there's the briefest transition, and we're back to flippant again. Is doing that, the cello is accompanying almost maniacally. I've always found that it's almost one of the silliest things ever written for the cello, but somehow here it really works, and it's really creating that tension between something that's really quite serious and then something that's really quite flippant. Now, for the majority of the concerto, the cello has been operating as a solo voice, so often in these soliloquies and these cadenzas, and then just there in opposition to the orchestra. But after this maniacal flipping of moods, the solo cello joins forces with the orchestral cellos to settle things down and re-establish this kind of nobilmente character from the very beginning of the piece. It's a terrific moment. This resolute statement of the theme, it breaks this cycle, and it brings us to the final section of the concerto with this very short but really important transition. And I'm making them play this moment because it's a moment I love. There's this really brief moment in the double basses at the end, and it sounds like a series of 5 heartbeats that introduces an incredibly serious moment. Let's just hear that transition. And that introduces a long passage of recitative, again, for the solo cello, which finally leads to a moment where we are starting to realise some of the things that weren't quite finished in the slow movement, and we get this unrestrained outpouring of emotion. And this moment, which is really finally getting there, it's still a variation of that very first idea. Here we get this leap of a seventh, which, if you remember, is the doubled fourths. Remember how I said 4 + 4 is 7 in music? We get a leap of a seventh, and then it falls back by those falling thirds again. But the bigger distances create this great sense of emotion. And once again, it's underpinned by absolutely brilliant orchestration, because one of the difficult things about cello concertos is the instrument's relatively low, and making an orchestration where you can hear it is quite difficult. Elgar does that brilliantly here so that we don't lose the cello in this very full sound. So you hear how the orchestra gets out of the way, and we just get those little stings in there that support the cello. This bit leads to a final memory of the slow movement, and that ends like a final question. And then in the very next bar, we realise that we've actually known the answer to this question all along. This closing of the circle, the end being the beginning, it's a very powerful technique, and it cements the overall sense of the piece. Repeating the opening statement right at the end, it confirms that the whole work has been backward-looking, written in the past tense, if you like. Where a work like, for example, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony starts in tragic mode and ends up somewhere completely different, it creates this sense of redemption and of finding a way forward. Here in this cello concerto, it's all about looking back and those conflicted feelings that brings. There's one final contradiction worth noting with this piece, and it's that despite being a work about loss and nostalgia, composed by a man at the end of his life, some of the most important interpreters of this piece have actually been young. Beatrice Harrison, who was actually Elgar's preferred interpreter of the work, she made the very first recording of the work in 1920. Elgar was an earlier adopter of recording technology. She was just 28, and of course Jacqueline du Pré was only 20 years old when she made the recording that actually would bring this piece back to the mainstream repertoire. And I think you'll have to agree that we have seen that tradition continued this evening, because we've been treated to some amazing playing by some really very young people, and it really serves to remind us of the power that this sort of music has to communicate across generations and across centuries. So thank you all for joining us here tonight. Thanks for everyone who helped put this together. We are now going to hear the fourth movement of Elgar's Cello Concerto complete. Thanks. Thank you.